Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast. I'm Fraser Rice. I'm joined by Christine Benz. She's the Director of Personal Finance and Retirement at Morningstar, and she's the author of the new book, How to Retire. She goes into a lot of different interviews, 20 of them in fact, that surround the topic both from an investment and qualitative standpoint, and I'm really thrilled to have her on. Welcome aboard, Christine.
Fraser, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
The honor's here. You get around in the space at Morningstar and beyond, and so to be able to sort of kick the tires on your book and hear a little bit about the process of it is exciting at my end. Before we get into some of the different retirement issues, what was the gist of starting the book? At what point did you say to yourself, you know what, I think there needs to be a book written around the whole retirement concept?
Well, I have been toiling on the retirement planning space for, 20 years now. And one of the reasons I enjoy it so much is because it's such a broad space that my initial interest and really where my expertise is in the realm of constructing portfolios for retirement drawdown. But there's so much else that surrounds that question of how to structure a portfolio, issues like long-term care, healthcare, relationships, purpose, identity. All of those things are a crucial component to having a successful retirement plan. And I do think you need to talk about them holistically, which is the reason that I wanted the book to be interviews with experts, with subject matter experts in all these different areas. I didn't have to suffer with my own imposter syndrome about, pretending to be an expert on everything. I was able to draw in a lot of external expertise. And I am very happy with the book, with how the book came out, because I do feel like it's holistic and I hope that it's helpful for people. Well,
I'm not at the retirement sort of stage yet, although I have to think about my own at some point. And I really like the way you surrounded the topic, I guess, in a way of putting it, sort of flooding the zone with the different areas around the investment component, but the qualitative especially, because I've seen it in my practice and elsewhere that a lot of that gets short shrift, and we spend a lot of time talking about stocks versus bonds and how do you withdraw responsibly and don't run out of money and that type of thing. One area which I think was particularly interesting was the concept of transitioning into retirement and some of the emotional sort of either change or withdrawal or something when you go from one type of life into another one, and one where people have to redefine their purpose, going from an occupation often into something different. What was your thought process around that when you were talking to your interviewees?
Yeah, and I think this is a particularly relevant point to people who are successful in their careers, that stepping away from those careers, even though someone may want to spend time on other activities, they may feel burned out from that job, they probably still are getting some things from that job that may be hard to leave behind. So identity is a big thing that we get from our jobs. And of course, that tends to be particularly so for people who are in kind of prestige professions in our society, attorneys and doctors and so forth. But really for all of us who have felt like we've had some success, some wins in our careers, stepping away from that and being without that sense of who you are, I think is something that people struggle with. So I wanted to talk about that, how I have come to be a strong believer in the idea of a phased in retirement, that ideally, if you can kind of step back and think about the components of your job that you still do really enjoy and carry them forward and find a way to do them longer, I think that redounds to the benefit of a successful retirement plan. And I also take pains to say it doesn't need to be some literal version of the thing that is that someone's doing now. So an example I've been talking about is I have a close friend who was an executive in several corporations in the Chicago area, has always been in leadership roles, and recently retired. She is pretty burned out from the corporate world, but it's pretty clear to me that she's meant to be a leader of people, even in her next act. So even if she, continues on and decides she wants to do more volunteer activities, for example, putting herself in that role to lead people should be something that she tries to carry forward. So I think the 10 years before someone's anticipated retirement date, that's a really good time to do some experimentation. If you are employed by an employer, talk to that employer about potentially shedding some of the parts of your job that you wish to do less, keeping some of the things that you want to continue doing. And I tell people to do the Sunday night calendar test, where you're sitting down and you're kind of looking at your week ahead and taking stock of the days on your calendar. And you inevitably will have things where you'll say, that's going to be a good day because I get to, be in this meeting with this group of people I really like, or have lunch with this person who I really enjoy, whatever it is. And then inevitably you have things where you're like, okay, I got to get through that one, but that's not my favorite thing. If you can try to use that to light the way of how you spend your remaining time in the workforce, I think that definitely makes for a successful retirement plan and helps make that transition into retirement easier.
One of the things that I advise people when I get asked this question is that I think it is a really good idea to frame out the first year or even the first 2 years of retirement. And by that, I mean going from what previously had been structured time to what is usually thought of as unstructured time, and maybe taking some effort and putting some structure around that initial first year or two. I think we're littered with all sorts of examples of people who, they drop out of the workforce and all of a sudden they go straight to watching 8 hours of TV a day. And that's not the right, really, framework for a happy and successful requirement, both for yourself and everyone around you.
Well, absolutely. And I love that idea as well. In fact, Jamie Hopkins in the book talks about trying to fill out a calendar for retirement. And he said that when he goes through this with people, oftentimes he'll say, okay, we've got like 4 hours of a week here that we've talked about. Maybe it's working out or whatever it is. What are you going to do the rest of the time? And I do think it's important for people to think, obviously, their relaxation activities, they want more of those, whether it's golf or travel or, time with kids and grandkids. You definitely want that stuff. You want the happy relaxation time. But Michael Finka makes the point in the book that you need to relax from something, that balance is so important, and that continues into retirement, that you enjoy relaxation and leisure activities that much more if you felt that you've gotten something done. And that may be some version of your work activities, it may be some charitable endeavors, but balance, I think, is super important. Yeah.
What do you think about dry runs? And by that, I mean taking some time while you're employed to sort of live with unstructured time, or maybe a different way to put it too is live with your spouse on a more direct basis. I've seen lots of issues related to people who have been used to living apart during the day, and then all of a sudden they're together for a long period of time during the day, during the, let's call it, the working hours, and that's a transition, to be sure. How did you think about that in your interviews?
Yeah, I love that idea, Fraser, of doing a dry run, doing a sabbatical if you can. My employer has long had a sabbatical program where you get a 6 week break from work every 4 years. And in the past couple of sabbaticals, I have used them. I've used them in part to do some travel, but I've used a good half of my sabbaticals to just spend time at home to figure out how those days, what those days would feel like, what they'd consist of, to try to build some of that balance into my days. Your point about couples, I think, is a super astute one. And the good news is that many of us had some experience with that during the pandemic. Many of us who are married had a lot of time with our partners. Did you like that? Did you not like that? Well, reflect on that period if you were, in fact, at home with your partner where both of you were kind of rattling around the house. My husband and I actually really enjoyed it. We had, lunch together every day, and we're able to do things that we don't normally get to do on a typical work day. But other people might have said, yeah, that was too much too much togetherness. And so reflect on that period. I think it's, obviously not a happy period for many of us, but at least gives you a chance to kind of check in on your feelings about being together with your spouse for that much time.
My girlfriend and I during COVID, we had that same experience where we were together a lot. And one thing that I did was, we're lucky enough to have our own residences within the city here. I, both from a career standpoint and from a creating structure for myself standpoint, so I didn't get crazy, was to go down to my other place and go down there and work during the week, so that I had something to go to and something to mark the days and then the weeks as they sort of melted away. And it made the together time that much better. And so, I try to tell that lesson to other people who are willing to listen, that sometimes creating that structure, that separate life, can be useful going forward.
Yeah, and not just in terms of physical space. It literally gives you something to talk about as a
Right.
couple, right? If you're having separate experiences during the day, when you meet up, you have more to discuss, and it just makes life more interesting. So I would recommend some version of that. If, I think Fritz Gilbert in the book calls it like he time, she time, and we time. And maybe it's he, and we, whatever your couple configuration is. But I think it's helpful for people to have separate experiences, and then when you come together, you do have more to discuss.
One of the chapters that really had an impact on me came from your interview with Carolyn McClanahan around long-term care, but really more specifically around kind of end-of-life / caregiver status that many retired couples end up, let's call it and put in quotations, graduate into over time. What did you take from that discussion? I found that her viewpoint on it, and I've known her for a long time, it's just important and something that I think a lot of people take for granted that needs discussion. That transition from, in a sense, one type of occupation to maybe a different lifestyle to then maybe turning into a different occupation that you didn't really bargain for, that goes underestimated.
100%. And Carolyn, for people who do not know her, is a financial planner and also a medical doctor. And so she brings together those two things beautifully in her work and in her talks, where she discusses the financial implications of healthcare, but also the human implications of healthcare and long-term care and aging. Long-term care, unfortunately, is a really tough problem from both a financial standpoint and kind of an emotional quality of life standpoint. One issue that we have here in the U.S. is that we have a caregiver shortage. So even people with the financial wherewithal who want to pay for someone to come into their home to provide them long-term care may be under some stress finding appropriate people. So that's a challenge. And then you reference the very real issue that spouses are oftentimes caregivers for one another. And because of the way that longevity shakes out, and because of the fact that women tend to live a couple of years longer than their male partners, women are oftentimes caregivers for their partners, and no one's around to caregive for them. So there are stresses certainly on whichever partner is providing that long-term care for his or her spouse, and that can certainly change the dynamics of that relationship. It's also important to note that the primary caregivers in this country tend to be friends and family members, mainly family members, mainly spouses, and also adult children. And so I think people need to kind of take stock of how much care they would like their close loved ones to provide for them, and how much they would like to rely on outside care, and really articulate those wishes well in advance of having those needs come on.
Along that line, and many times kids become part of the caregiving equation. But from a larger standpoint, what did you discover in your interviews around the communication of the retirement plan to the next generation? Not that you necessarily need the kids' buy-in for what you do in your retirement, but sometimes you do, in terms of knowing where they are, maybe integration with the grandkids and so on. What were your takeaways from your discussions with people on that front?
Yeah, Cameron Huddleston did a great discussion on that topic. And she has a book, I think it's called Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk, that is about communication between generations, mainly about financial matters. And Cameron has a really poignant personal story where her father passed away very suddenly, quite young, and her mom had early onset dementia. And so Cameron was left to kind of sort things out without her parents having ever shared the details of their financial lives. Her father passed away without having shared his wishes about his funeral and the disposition of his property and so forth. So her chapter is really born out of personal experience, and it's a cautionary tale. Don't do that.
Right.
Lay the groundwork where you are sitting down with an estate planner very preemptively, and I like the idea of also attending to kind of a succession plan for your financial affairs. I run into a lot of DIY type investors where I am often talking about the importance of, okay, have some kind of master directory where you're documenting all of your investments. You are articulating whatever sort of investment strategy you're using. I think that piece of the puzzle sometimes gets missed.
I mean, that's in a sense my day job all day, every day is to
Yeah.
create that sort of master book, that playbook that lists all of the different sets of information, whether it's the key contacts, the people who are sort of affected, what the flow charts of how things work are, whom do you call when this or that needs attention, that type of thing. A lot of people, it's one thing to go from sort of the estate plan when you ink it, and then 6 months later, when no one knows where to find anything, that there's a real sense of chaos that I think certainly those of us in the advice field can do a better job really helping people sort of get to that point. One of the other chapters, and it's with Jenny Roselle, who is really one of my favorites. I had a show with her, and I guess it was 6 months or 8 months ago, and I think she does a terrific job articulating the estate planning process and a lot of the issues that go with it really well. As we get to these ends of life types of situations, and there are people who either there's dementia at play or in general kind of understanding what the world looks like once they've passed and they've had their retirement, and the rest of the world is sort of left to deal with their legacy. What did you take away from her discussion? By the way, I'm just a gigantic fan of hers. I think she does a really good job taking the complex and making it pretty simple.
Well, I would agree. In fact, I asked several financial advisors who I know about who would be a good resource for this part of the book where we talk about the what you need as part of your estate plan. And I kept hearing Jenny's name again and again. So I was so glad to have met her through the course of working on this book. And she discusses the basic documents that people need as part of their estate plans. But she also gets into some of the family dimensions that she certainly encounters with her practice, with her estate planning practice. So she brings a really nice human component into the discussion. She discusses the kind of intergenerational dynamic that's inevitably part of estate planning. And I think she does it beautifully and clearly, which was really important to me for this book. I wanted it to be something that financial professionals could use, but also that lay people could pick up and follow along with. And I felt like she did a terrific job of that.
One thing that I took from her situation and that I have witnessed firsthand is one of the big problems with estate planning, once you actually get around to doing it and so on, is the staffing of the different estate planning roles, whether it's the executor or the trustee or various other situations. And I thought she dealt with it well in your book, and it alludes to other issues that people start getting experience with, especially around making decisions for other folks via proxy or sort of in mental health situations. As part of the larger communication component, and getting back to the chapter where talking about the structures and so on are communicated to the next generation, were there any other truths that you saw to that that were instructive?
So, yeah, I think that Jenny talks about the family dynamics that can come into play, as does Cameron Huddleston in her chapter, where Cameron notes that many people are reticent to even create an estate plan at all because, they feel like it's sort of a glimpse into their future and they don't love the look of some of those things. And so I thought she made an astute point, which is that the earlier you have one, the less real it seems and sort of the easier it is to dip a toe into this world. So I thought that was a good piece of guidance that if you start earlier before when your mortality is kind of just an abstraction, that it makes keeping the whole thing up to date a bit easier. I think Jenny talked in her section about how this is not a place for honorifics when you're naming powers of attorney, people to handle your powers of attorney and to be your executor and so forth, that you don't just want to turn to the person, say your oldest child or even your child at all, that sometimes a professional fiduciary is really the person you want in certain situations. And I thought that was good advice as well.
Yeah, no question. I tell people who are interested in that topic, I say, you need to find someone who is the most detail oriented and conscientious of the group of people that you have at your beck and call, because these roles have real responsibility and teeth to them if things go wrong. And so you want someone who's going to execute it when it doesn't happen. It can be chaos later on.
Right. And updating them, I thought, was an interesting dimension of this as well. And I referenced my dad. My dad was exactly as you described, conscientious, good with financial matters, detail oriented. So he was executor for all kinds of people, all his cousins. He was the go-to. And then, at some point, my dad's in his 80s. It just wasn't necessarily how he felt like spending his time. I think a lot of the people in his inner circle had not really thought about, well, how would this progress when we're all in our 80s? So keeping some of those jobs up to date and potentially putting in a younger generation makes a lot of sense for all of us as we age.
No question. And for me, a rule of thumb is that at a certain point when you're going through that updating process, and there's lots of good milestones to do that, whether they're marriages or births or deaths or moves and things like that, that the advice team around you, or that the people who occupy those roles, should be a good 10 years plus younger than you are. And it's usually the opposite, because people went to places that they trusted, and those people all kind of age out, or they get strokes, or they die, or any of those types of things. And then suddenly you're left scrambling at a point of maximum emotional stress to make sure that you have people in place that can get stuff done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yes, within the professional team, I think it makes a ton of sense to think about the age and think about what the succession strategy is there.
We've talked a lot of doom and gloom and things to worry about, and how do you structure things and interviews and all that stuff. The enjoyment of retirement, the ability to sort of reflect back, enjoy the fruits of your labor, the ability to spend time with your family and point toward a future legacy. What did you sort of get from the interviews on that front? Maybe some good experiences that that maybe are a little bit different from sort of the gloom and doom and overarching complexity and so on that attaches to this difficult topic.
Right. So I loved the conversation with Laura Karstensen, who is a professor at Stanford, professor of psychology at Stanford and head of the Stanford Center on Longevity. She's one of my favorite thinkers on retirement and aging. And we talked about relationships later in life. And she has found in her research that older adult social networks do tend to winnow down a bit as they age. And some of that is indeed for sad reasons, that people, get sick and die or move away. But a lot of that is self-selection, that as we age, we do tend to reduce the number of people in our close inner circle. And her research points to that being generally very positive, that we are self selecting into a network of people who really value us, who we really value. She notes that as we move through our lives, we inevitably pick up friends, but she said some of them maybe, I think she calls them peripheral others, where they're not especially close to you. They may be perfectly good people to spend time with, say, after the soccer game or after the track meet, but they're not, the people who you truly love spending time with. And so we tend to shed some of those relationships, and that's perfectly okay. But her point is that you don't want that network to get too small. You would want it to be three or four or five, perhaps, people who you really feel a close connection to. And if you lose one of those people from the inner circle, think about, well, how do I build my network a little bit again? So I thought that that was a really interesting observation. And she also mentioned that those of us who are introverts, who kind of feel like we need to recharge after spending time with people, that the data on relationships and happiness don't actually show that the introverts among us are less happy, even though we tend to think of happy people as people who have tons of friends, that introverts can be perfectly happy as well. So that was one that I thought was kind of an uplifting chapter. And I also love Jordan Grummett's final chapter of the book. Jordan is a hospice doctor, and that sounds terribly gloomy, but he has some lessons from having worked with his patients at the end of their lives about how we can take this longer period of our retirements and just use it to make sure that in the end that we won't have any regrets. And he has a super reassuring message, which is that many people at retirement have kind of this list of aspirations of goals that they want to accomplish, whether it's writing a novel or starting a foundation. They might have some very aspirational type of goals. But he said that you might also have what he calls kind of smaller P purpose type goals that might be just being a phenomenal parent or a phenomenal partner to your spouse, or it might be revisiting some childhood hobby that you've set aside, or maybe finding some brand new hobby. And his point is that those smaller P purposes can be just as important as those big P aspirational purposes. So even if you don't have this sense of, oh, this is what I need to be doing with my retirement years, these big P purposes, a set of smaller P purposes is just fine too.
Really good stuff. Christine, I'm going to put the link to Amazon and other things to get to the book, How to Retire, but how do listeners get a hold of you, keep track, get to your podcast, etc.?
Sure. So I am on morningstar.com regularly doing videos, doing articles. And my podcast that I co host with a couple of my colleagues is called The Long View. And it is an interview format, a lot like this one, where we talk to thought leaders in investing, personal finance, retirement planning.
Terrific. Christine, continued success with the book. It's been really well reviewed, and I think it's going to have a nice impact. And I really like the book from the sense that it gives you a really good broad base to think about the various issues that are around retirement. Many people get focused on the money, but then there are these other parts that we talked about today, and I encourage everyone to give it a look. Thank you for being on.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.